it seems like my computer's not wanting to do that. So please, if you have any questions, I guess Nate, maybe just hop in. Basically, the way this is going to work, if you guys can see my screen, is, yeah, we'll start by talking about the history and policy and research. And I'll talk about one of our studies. Nate will talk about two of our studies. And then I'll end up with just what we're up to next. And really look forward to all your questions.
Hey, Max, it looks like the slide deck isn't.
Oh, is this not presenting the right thing?
Showing your blank desktop right now.
Thanks. Let's try this again. Is this working now?
Yep, it's good now.
Okay, sorry about that, thanks. Yeah, so we'll start with what UBI is, what's happening with UBI today, and how the policy and ideas have evolved. Some of the evidence on UBI, which is really around cash transfers. There's been a lot of evidence, especially in recent years, with a revolution in empirical economics, really testing these ideas, not just putting them into a hypothetical simulation. And then I'll talk a bit about our research into Andrew Yang's freedom dividend. He was a presidential candidate this past year, and now he's actually reportedly running for mayor of New York City. So the freedom dividend was the UBI plan that really was a centerpiece of his campaign. And Nate will talk about a child allowance, which is essentially a UBI for kids, and also our research, which is extra relevant today because it seems like there's going to be a deal in Congress for renewing the a relief package. So we did some research comparing unemployment benefits to universal payments, and we'll close with what's next for us. The Basic Income Earth Network is a group that's worldwide that discusses and advocates UBI, and they define a UBI as a periodic cash payment unconditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without means test or work requirement. So it's kind of a mouthful, but the idea is just give everyone money every month, usually, and don't condition it on anything. Don't make them do anything for it. Just give it to them. This idea started actually back in the 1500s with a philosopher named Thomas More, who wrote the book Utopia. And he was essentially opining on the roots of crime. He thought that given a lot of crime was property crime and still is today, that if people had the means to care for themselves, they wouldn't need to commit crime, and universal, just giving everyone amount would address that. Thomas Paine then came later, and he really was talking about land and all of our right to some of the fruits of Mother Nature, and the way to distribute that could be through a cash benefit to everyone. In more modern times, Milton Friedman is one of the more prominent conservative thinkers, and he actually promoted a pretty revolutionary idea at the time. It almost happened under President Nixon, and this would replace a bunch of benefits with what's called a negative income tax, which is essentially a UBI that phases out with income. But his idea was that this would simplify the safety net while also reducing poverty. And then Martin Luther King Jr., one of the last things he was focused on before he was killed was economic justice. And he talked about guaranteeing everyone an income to promote that. So today, it's less philosophical in that way. It's largely about resilience. And so, for example, I actually came from tech before I moved into economic policy, and automation was a big concern there. So we might have a lot of jobs that would go away because of robots, artificial intelligence, automation, all that. So UBI could be a way to ensure that everyone has the same, at least some sort of living standard as their job may evaporate. COVID-19 has introduced a whole new set of challenges, with governments really having to respond immediately and quickly to the challenges of people being unable to work. So these hypotheticals of automation displacing jobs, all that happened pretty immediately in March. So there's been a lot more unconditional cash payments as a result of that. And now there's actually experiments happening worldwide. There's been experiments dating back even to the 1970s. So Canada had a number, the US also had some, So these little green blue dots, those are all experiments that happened in the past where they just gave people money unconditionally. And this was actually kind of some of the first experiments where they had a control group. They would give some money to some people in an area and not to others. So it really advanced the science of economics back then. And we see this continuing today. There's a number of experiments that are promoting UBI or something like UBI with cash transfers. I'm based in California, so Stockton, California has a pretty well-known experiment that they're also doing a randomized controlled trial. Probably the most exciting one is from Kenya, where a charity named Give Directly, which really specializes in these unconditional cash transfers, is doing a UBI experiment. The first results just came out a few months ago and showed pretty promising results. We'll actually talk a little bit about that. But you can kind of see it's happening all over. There's cash transfer programs in Brazil that are being experimented on and tested rigorously in Asia, in Europe, everywhere. And policymakers are wanting even more of this. So for example, Stockton Mayor Michael Tubbs actually started a group called Mayors for Guaranteed Income, which now has over 30 mayors across the US who are advocating for the same kind of unconditional cash transfers in their own town. And the idea is test it out and then maybe see if it changes the policy mood. India also has promoted UBI. They actually have a pretty challenging problem because they have so many different programs, and some of them are very prone to corruption. So the idea is if you give everyone money, it's going to be a lot more transparent than the kinds of programs they have. The Lib Dem Party, the number 3 party in the UK, endorsed UBI a couple months ago, and the number of MPs who are elected leaders there have called for trials of UBI similarly to the mayor's program. Here in California also, there was just a bill announced that would introduce a UBI, and also senators in Canada are promoting UBI as well. So it's really definitely taking off, especially this year. There's also just more broadly a lot of cash assistance programs. So in the US, there's probably one of the more prominent bills among the Democratic Party has been essentially a child allowance where you give cash to parents to care for, to offset some of the costs of taking care of kids. There's also been economic impact payments, which were done as part of the COVID relief package. Brazil did a similar program. They expanded their existing cash transfer program as a result of COVID. And also just a lot of charities are working more on cash-based interventions. So refugee agencies, aid agencies within countries are all considering cash as opposed to, for example, sending food directly or even a voucher for food. And this really presents two core differences from the way we approach safety net policy today. So one is that it's cash, it's not in kind. You're not giving people food, you're not giving people a home to live in, you're not giving them clothes, you're just giving them cash and letting them buy what they want. And there's a couple of reasons that people might philosophically support this kind of idea. First of all, it's simpler and cheaper for providers, whether that's a government or an aid agency. It's just even big programs in the US like food stamps cost about 10% in overhead costs. And that's partially eligibility, but it's also partially because you have to figure out, is this good? Is a sandwich eligible for food stamps or is it not? What kind of exact goods and how you program the barcodes, all that kind of stuff. So it is expensive to implement. Cash is also more liberating for recipients. So if you are getting cash, you don't have to worry about whether, again, is this kind of sandwich or salad okay for food stamps? You just buy it with cash the same way everyone else does. And the second biggest one, which is really quite different, is that it's universal. It's not means tested. So it's not limited by the income you have or the assets you have. And some of the reasons here, again, philosophically, to support this kind of idea would be it improves work incentives, actually, because every time you phase out a benefit or you say it's only limited to people who earn below a certain amount, you're really discouraging people from working because it's effectively a tax, right? So that's one reason economically it would be advantageous. Also, at the personal level, you're avoiding these errors that often occur. And actually, there's a really interesting paper from a lot of developing countries showing that universal programs tend to reach the poor much more than targeted programs do. Because once you're targeting, you're having to basically ask people for information, and that request can then result in some of the people who are most worst, really worst off and least able to comply with those kind of requirements. So that's the philosophical side. How about the evidence? There is a huge amount of evidence actually on cash transfers, which has just grown in recent years. So here's some research from a paper we did on child allowances a couple months ago, showing that across a number of randomized control trials, so these are the same kinds of programs that we use to evaluate medicines, like the vaccines right now, they did the same thing in sub-Saharan Africa to try to evaluate how these cash transfer programs affect poverty and also measures of material deprivation. And the results were pretty strong. So in general, the poverty rate reduced quite a bit among the people who received cash transfers. And they also, the rate of owning a blanket, shoes, change of clothes, all of those rose pretty considerably. There's a number of other similar kind of studies showing that, for example, schooling improves, people spend on their kids, nutrition generally improves. So just a wide range of positive impacts. And also some of the most common concerns are around labor supply. I think some more research could be needed in terms of permanent changes, because these are often programs are evaluated maybe on the order of a few years. But in general, this meta-analysis from some World Bank researchers found that cash transfers tend to result in little to no change in adult labor. And when it does reduce labor, it's folks who are elderly, so maybe they're retiring a bit earlier. There's also some increase in schooling from other papers showing that people move out of the labor force into schooling or to take care of their kids. So some of these questions are, if you're taking care of your kids, that doesn't increase GDP, but it is a socially valuable activity. There's been a number of studies actually also that compare cash transfers to other interventions side by side. So instead of just saying, we're going to test cash transfers in isolation, compare it to the kind of effects you would get from testing some other intervention, we're going to have the same people and essentially assign people to either a control group that gets nothing, or a group that gets cash transfers, or a group that gets some other kind of intervention. And pretty much across the board, these have shown that cash transfers outperform the intervention, even on the kind of outcomes that you would care about that intervention improving. So for example, USAID, which is the US aid group, they compared a job training program to handing out cash, and actually even on job training focused measures, cash recipients ended up doing better, so earnings and things like that. Similarly, there was a nutrition program. Nutrition outcomes improved about as much with cash compared to interventions that were specifically focused on nutrition. And just last month, there was a study comparing a psychotherapy program with mental health, and cash transfer recipients had improved mental health, while people who got the psychotherapy actually did not at all. And there was a study from Give Directly, this nonprofit that focuses on cash transfers. They have a UBI, a true UBI, where they are giving people for up to 12 years in an entire village. They're giving every single person a monthly payment, and they're having a randomized control trial that shows the effect. And they started this a few years ago, so they were able to see how did the UBI group compare to other groups during the COVID-19 crisis. And they found that people were less likely to go hungry. They did have earnings fall, but it was largely because they had such higher earnings to begin with, because they had been able to invest in their businesses. And lots of businesses have not done well, but they've had better food security and other kinds of outcomes. One last thing is that if you think of UBI compared to other programs, I mentioned before that if you mean test programs, that actually creates problems with work incentives. And you see this in the data. So here's a chart basically of the poverty status. So people who are right around the poverty line, if they have kids, because they are losing so much benefits for every dollar that they earn, they actually face marginal tax rates above 50%. This is the average. So some people even 70, 80, 90% marginal tax rates. This is double what even the highest income Americans pay. So it's kind of, this is not a problem that you would run into if you had a UBI where you aren't phasing out the programs. We would not be taxing the poor more than other groups. So that's the end of the other evidence. We're going to talk about some research we've contributed at the UBI Center. And to start, our mission is to really produce open source research that informs a robust policy debate around the idea of UBI. So while a number of other nonprofits, such as Give Directly, are focused on what kinds of evidence do we need from the field, what kinds of actual experiments should we do, what kind of cash transfer designs should we implement and test, we are focused more on if we were to implement UBI as a public policy, what would that mean for the economy, for the distributional impact, for poverty, using the kinds of results that we get from experiments like what Give Directly is doing. So we have researchers all over the world now. It's been a really exciting time. So US, Canada, UK, and Australia. And our goal is to answer some questions that really economic models are necessary to address. So for example, how would the economy respond? Not just people's labor supply, which maybe if you know you're getting income for 2 years, it might respond differently than if you know you're getting it for your whole life. But also how do capital markets respond? How does the government deficit that might be the result of different UBI policy designs, how does that affect the economy? And then the distributional effects, so how does it affect poverty, inequality, and also who gains, who loses? Because really any major change like UBI would produce some people who might be better off without it, at least in the short term. And under most designs, that's going to be relatively rich people, but it's still, I think, important to know who those people are. And all of this would depend on how it's funded. So is it funded through taxes? Are you just going to deficit fund it? Or are you going to replace other programs? How much of those other programs are you going to replace? So it's really redesigning the entire safety net, including how much you give to each kind of person. For example, kids might get less or even more than adults. People who maybe are eligible for Social Security could get a different amount, people with disabilities. So there's a whole bunch of factors that go into defining UBI. It's not one concrete policy. Our goal is to quantify how those choices affect the results. So I'll talk about the freedom dividend, which is the Andrew Yang UBI plan, and then turn it over to Nate for a couple other projects. Freedom dividend was a pretty complicated policy. So the core of it was $1,000 per month for every adult citizen. And that requires a lot of money, about $3 trillion per year to fund it. So Andrew Yang proposed a number of funding systems to raise that kind of money. One was, he said, for people who get means-tested benefits today, they would choose between their existing set of means-tested benefits or the UBI, the freedom dividend. So that saves some money because basically people are rescinding their benefits if they opt for the UBI, or they might not get the UBI if they choose to preserve their existing benefits. But really the big one is a value-added tax of 10%. So the US is actually the only country in the world, developed country, that does not have a VAT. And it raises a ton of money in other developed countries. So this was the main way of funding it. Also a financial transaction tax, carbon tax, lifting the cap on Social Security contributions, so basically increasing payroll taxes for high earners, and also treating capital gains as ordinary income. So currently capital gains incur a lower tax rate. So all of this raised not quite enough to fund the freedom dividend, but did raise over $1 trillion in revenue. And the taxes rise across all income groups. So this is the average tax rate by income decile. People in the top decile paid about $30,000 more in taxes compared to about $1,000 more in the bottom decile. That is quite a bit less than the actual UBI in the bottom decile, which is $12,000 for an individual. So that meant that the net effect was positive for most households. So plus $10,000 for most people except the top decile. But really what matters is how much in percentage terms. This is usually how policy is evaluated. What's the percentage of impact on each income decile? And if that is decreasing, then that's a sign that's progressive. In this case, it over doubled the income of the bottom decile, and it would raise income for the bottom 9 deciles as well. It turns out even if you adjust the amount, you still get a pretty progressive effect. So if you shrink it from $1,000 to $470, you're going to get a pretty much budget neutral policy. And that's still going to increase the bottom decile's income by about 45% and reduce it for the top decile by about 9%. The last thing I'll say, and Nate's going to show some more interactive tools, but we actually built a calculator so you can see how this policy would affect you. So if you select the freedom dividend from this tool we built, it's at plans.ubicenter.org. I should put that in the slide. But we've got the extent to which it reduces poverty. So poverty falls 74% in the original. It falls about, I think, 35% in the budget neutral freedom dividend. So really major poverty impacts. It reduces inequality, raises median income. But the cool thing is you can actually select how many adults do you have, how many children do you have, what's your income, what kind of benefits do you get, and it'll tell you on average what the effect of the policy is going to be for you after you include the UBI, the amount more you would pay in taxes, and the amount that you would see reduced in benefits. So you can visit that all at plans.ubicenter.org. With that, I will turn it over to Nate for our other 2 research projects.
Thanks, Max. I will share my screen now and present. So as Max had alluded to before, one of our most recent analyses was about comparing unemployment and budget equivalent universal payments. And this has been a hot topic in today's current politics as the Congress is trying to agree on a new stimulus package. Democrats have been mostly focused on enhanced unemployment at the federal level. In the first bill, we had FPUC, the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation Plan, which added about $600 a week to people's unemployment that they were already getting from the state. So we said, well, Democrats have been really focused on the unemployment, but is that actually the best way to get money to people that need it? So we decided to compare in 2 phases. So in phase 1, we had April to July, and in phase 2 was August to December. So the idea here was that you take all the money that we're going to spend on unemployment and you say, what if we took that exact same amount of money and just divided it up and mailed it out to everyone? So those were the 2 policies that we compared, and a deal may have been reached today that would have extended the FPUC to $300 a week for the next 10 weeks. So I think I got a little bit ahead here, but so yeah, we have these budget equivalent policies, and I really just want to make sure we're all on the same page for that. If we took all the money we were going to spend on unemployment and we said instead, let's take that exact same lump sum of money and send it to every adult, or send it to every adult and kid, because Republicans have been kind of focused on payroll tax cuts, we also compared a budget equivalent payroll tax cut. So if we cut taxes that decreased revenue by the same amount we're spending on UI or the UBI, what would be the effects? So we looked at this in two phases. And in the first phase, we found that Congress got it right, that the enhanced unemployment was the most progressive policy. So you kind of see it here in the gray that the $600 per week UI um, is lowers poverty the most. One thing I forgot to touch on is that we simulated this over the last 10 years. So to kind of compare different years on what would be the most um, comparative to today is probably 2009, because that was when we had another recession. So in 2009, that's kind of where we focused for this policy. And in the first phase, unemployment was cut the most by, or poverty was cut the most by the increased unemployment. And that was the same for the poverty gap, which is kind of the total dollar amount between that it would take to raise everyone out of poverty. So it's a total dollar gap between every person in poverty and their poverty threshold. So again, the FPUC was the best policy there. And that was also true for fighting inequality. The FPUC was the best policy at fighting inequality. But then we looked at phase two. So we've already done FPUC phase one. What's the best policy going forward? Should we continue to do FPUC, or should we take the money that we're going to spend on a second round of FPUC and give everyone a universal check? And here's where we found that the universal payments were superior at fighting poverty in particular. So the dark blue line is a check to everyone, including children, and the light blue line is a check to just adults. So you can see that including children is very important when it comes to cutting poverty. The only sending to adults was about equivalent to FPUC, looking at 2009 as a barometer for today. And these findings were true across the poverty gap, where the universal payments that included children were the best at fighting poverty and at fighting inequality. So if we took that same amount of money that we're about to spend on another round of FPUC and mailed every person and parent a check, the money doesn't actually go to the children, it goes to their parents, then it would be the best measure to reduce inequality and poverty. And we found that these benefits were particularly noticeable for some of the most, for children and people with disabilities. So child poverty may be no surprise that it falls the most when you include children in the UBI. And this is where you see a really big gap. Again, 2009 is a pretty good barometer for today's economy because of the both recessions. The universal payments, including children, perform a lot better than any of the other policies. And I haven't even mentioned payroll, because it's consistently the worst in all of our simulations, the payroll tax cuts. And then this, for people with disabilities, we also found that universal payments were the superior to FPUC. So this was really important in guiding conversation for the second stimulus package. Phase one, we got it right, and we helped people that lost their jobs. But in phase two, it would be better to send everyone a check. We recognize that today's economy differs from 2009, but it's the best example that we have. So for context, like there's been a lot of focus on that when you send everyone an unemployment check, you're helping the people that don't have an income right now. But that misses the full picture, that only 1 in 3 people living in poverty are in the labor force. Children are not in the labor force, seniors, people with disabilities. And when we only focus on unemployment, we leave these people out, and it tends to not be the most progressive reform. And also just the unemployment benefits have diminishing returns to them, so that, you know, once we've done one round, if we keep sending the same people checks and forgetting about other people, there's going to be a cost to that. So that was our simulation there, which was really relevant to today. And one of our most recent simulations, which I was super pumped about, and it's really interactive, so we're going to get into that, was a child allowance simulation. One thing I noted before is that we found it's really important to include children in UBI. That's been a finding consistent across our simulations, but that sometimes targeting children at smaller levels of funding for your UBI is better than sending everyone a check. So a child allowance is basically just a UBI for kids. Parents get a monthly or a periodic check, and per child. So research shows that child poverty worsens educational entertainment, earnings, and health. It has a huge impact on our children and our economy. So to combat child poverty, most countries, especially in Europe, give parents a monthly stipend. In the US, we have a more convoluted system with the child tax credit that leaves out a lot of the poorest families because it phases in and it has that high marginal tax rate that Max was talking about before. So there's been this bill in Congress, the American Family Act, which has been included in the HEROES Act by the Democrats for COVID-19, which is essentially a child allowance. It does phase out at the top, but it does ensure that children in the poorest homes receive the full benefit. So we decided to, and I'm just going to open it because it's so interactive. We decided to simulate a child allowance in every state at both the federal and state level. So how would every state be affected by a child allowance from $50 to $500 if that child allowance was happened at the federal level? Or what if we have nothing at the federal level, and what can states do on their own, and what will be the impact of that? So this graph kind of tells the quick story. If you go to the website, you'll be able to interact with it, that you can kind of hover over any state and see the current child poverty rate. So in Texas, it's 15.3%. In California, it's 19.6. You can kind of see these darker colors, especially in the South. In New York, 17.2. But if I click the play button, it'll start simulating the child allowances. So $50 a month or $100 a month, $150 a month. All of these are funded with a tax. So it's not just money, falling from the sky. It is funded with a tax, and I'll just let you see what happens. So as the child allowance increases, child poverty falls pretty drastically, and you can see the exact numbers by hovering over any state. California was at 19.5, it's fallen to 6.5. That's a 67% reduction in child poverty. That's a lot of kids who were living in poverty no longer living in poverty, and that's true across most U.S. states. We found for about $300 a month, you cut child poverty in half. If you want to do a deeper dive into any of the metrics or specific states, if you click on simulations, I'll give it a second to load here. You can see the tax rate that's required for any state. So say you live in Florida and you're particularly interested in Florida, you can see that they're kind of similar here. The necessary tax rate that we would need at both the state and the federal level, right? Richer states need higher or lower taxes because there's more money to tax, and poorer states like Kentucky would need higher tax rates than the federal level to fund the same child allowance. So you can see the tax rates, and I won't go through all of this data just because there's so much. You can see the distributional impact. So how do different child allowance amounts affect the bottom decile? At $500 a month, the average bottom decile, or the average family in the bottom decile, is seeing their incomes rise by $5,000. And you can kind of see for each amount, the smaller the child allowance, the smaller the benefits, the bigger the child allowance, the more the top decile pays, and that money is kind of being moved down here to children. You can see that by percentage, as Max was talking about, how that's an important metric. You can look at inequality. So how does the Gini coefficient, which is a measure that economists use for inequality. So like in DC, you can see that DC is really unequal. And as the child allowance increases, the inequality rate decreases. And then here's the poverty map from before. If you're interested in poverty by age, you can see how different child allowance amounts affect child poverty. So, I think my computer's playing it. Okay. So at $500 a month, or you can see child poverty falls by 69% in the US, right? So the child poverty rate goes from 13.9 to 4.3 nationally. And you can look at any state that you're interested in. There's Arizona, all three of the reforms that we simulated. You can look at it by race. Black and Hispanic children tend to be more likely to live in poverty. A child allowance can both cut Black child poverty, and the gap between black child poverty, and white child poverty. So there's just a ton of data here. I can't walk you through it all, but it's really great to have information if you want to write to your state legislators or anything like that to show just how powerful a child allowance can be for lifting children out of poverty. So I think that's it for the child allowance simulation. I really encourage you to join or check out the website and play around with yourself, but I think I'll pass it back over to Max to finish it out.
Cool. Thanks, Nate. Yeah, and that's, by the way, at child-allowance.ubicenter.org if you want to see that analysis. So what's next for us? I think you've seen some of our research, some of the research that others are doing showing the effects of UBI. We're really trying to expand the scope and depth of our research. So in terms of scope, everything you've seen today that we've done has been in the US, but we are expanding to the UK because there's been a lot of appetite there for it. So the Lib Dem party has endorsed UBI there, a number, I think over 500 MPs as well, and other local elected leaders have supported UBI. So we're building a UK simulation. We're actually building the first open source tax and benefit micro simulation model in the UK. So that's going to be used for the UBI analysis, but it could be used for any fiscal policy analysis that someone wants to do with that tool. So we're also simulating UBI in smaller local areas. That's something we're working on with a group called the Policy Simulation Library, which is another group of economists that work on open source projects. So their goal is to build a file at the state level or even local level where you could say, hey, Mayor Michael Tubbs, you're building this new approach in Stockton. Let's see how a UBI, not just an experiment, but a UBI policy would affect poverty and inequality in your local area. So that's really exciting. We're also looking to build this in real time, or at least on a monthly basis. Most of the really high quality data that we use is released every year. And obviously right now there's so much changing. I think that's going to continue to be the case for the next year or two, where we're going to see every month how's unemployment, poverty, all those kind of things changing. It requires some more data magic, but our goal is to build a UBI simulation where every month people know what the effect of the policy would be. We're also looking to incorporate macroeconomic responses into our simulations. So everything we've shown so far has been what they call static. So it assumes that people take the money and they don't adjust their labor responses. We know that that effect is not super strong from receiving the money. It's more strong in terms of what kind of tax they're incurring, because as Nate showed with the child allowance, we're funding that through a tax. So that probably would reduce labor supply some. Also, on the other hand, if we were to model replacing the existing benefits with a UBI, that should actually get people into the labor force more because they're not subject to these phase outs. So there are a number of models from basic to modeling the entire economy, modeling even global economies in terms of how capital markets and all that respond. So we're working with some pretty top-notch economists on all of that. And then I think benchmarking more policies. So as Nate showed with unemployment benefits, sometimes it's not obvious how other policies are going to compare to just giving everyone cash. And we actually did another analysis. Nate really worked on this on student debt. So if you were to cancel student loan debt, how does that compare to giving everyone money? And it's pretty much the same story, if not starker. Giving everyone money is more progressive policy in many ways. So, so there's a lot more policies like that that have been proposed. Lots more people will continue to introduce policies, and our goal, just like Give Directly and other experimental groups have compared other interventions to cash, our goal is to do that on the public policy side. And then something we haven't really talked about, except all the snazzy interactive graphics Nate showed, is we're really trying to advance the technological frontier of economic policy research. Everything we do is open source. We are the only economic policy think tank in the world, to our knowledge, that makes everything open source. So you can literally go to github.com where a bunch of open source code is hosted, and you'll see all of our analyses there, all of our websites, even the website that Nate showed, that's actually hosted on GitHub. So every single piece of it is extremely transparent, which means you don't have to trust that we have done the right thing, as a lot of think tanks sort of assume people, you sort of build credibility through knowing the right people. And lots of think tanks are doing great work, but we think our approach is just more open, more transparent, and also enables us to leverage the cutting edge of technologies that other people in the open source community are doing, whether that's data visualization or economic modeling. So with that, that is all we had. So really want to thank you all for your time, and we'll take your questions.
All right, great. Thank you, guys. So I want to open it up to anyone who's here in the meeting. If you'd like to unmute yourself and maybe just state your name and your question, you can do that now. So go ahead, and if not, we'll have a couple from the room in a moment.
I guess there's one question from Von Dormal in the chat, so we can address that. We have not, so the question is, did you guys do a study on the effects of the $1 trillion given to the banks and corporations in the beginning of the year compared to just giving it to the people? I think this is a mix of things. So some of it is the Federal Reserve purchasing assets and bonds and things like that. And those are really more like loans than grants. So we haven't studied the effect. And there actually are a number of people who are calling for the Fed to give aid directly to people instead of relying on essentially loans to bondholders and things like that. But I think part of this is also the PPP program, so the Paycheck Protection Program, which gave money to corporations for holding on to people, so retaining their payrolls. And I think that's a very similar program to the unemployment benefits. It's essentially paying employees to not, so that the government doesn't have to pay the unemployment benefits. So I think you'd probably see something pretty similar there, where maybe that was good at the beginning to hold on to some people, but probably a fair amount of that was also held by corporations. So I think it would probably be even more regressive. And I think in the future, there's going to be more hindsight looking at the economic analysis and seeing that direct cash payments might have been better than that as well, but we haven't looked at it yet. Thanks for that question.
All right, we've got another one in the chat. So it's, could you speak a little bit more about the expected macroeconomic effects of a truly universal basic income, aside from just labor supply? This person said they'd read apprehensions about runaway inflation, et cetera, but they're not familiar with the underlying data or reasoning.
It's very big.
Yeah, I'll take that as well. So I think inflation is a pretty tractable problem, and the way you mostly deal with it is by taxing, making sure that the program is funded. So if you think about the reason that inflation happens, it's because demand for goods exceeds the supply of those goods, and in terms of dollar terms. So if you just infuse money into the system without offsetting it in any way, then you would expect inflation to occur. But if you're essentially moving money between people, that should not affect inflation much. And there is some actual evidence on this as well. So Give Directly, this group that has really done amazing work on conditional cash transfers, one of their studies looked at the general equilibrium effects. So they basically, what that means is they gave money to everyone in a city on a city basis, and they gave it to multiple, well, they're really villages. And they found that prices did really not change that much in the villages that got the cash compared to those that didn't. One area, a study from Mexico, found that giving cash to people, they basically had a randomized control trial where they gave cash to some and they gave food directly to other people. And the villages that received the food, or the cash compared to the food, did have some inflation in food prices, but that was really just in areas where there was maybe one supplier. So like really remote villages where there's no competition for your local food producer, so they can kind of charge whoever they want. I think that's a really frictional kind of phenomenon that you wouldn't expect to see in the US, because there's in most places you can buy from a couple of different places, and it's pretty easy to enter a market if you're choosing to offer some service. So, to the extent that we phase this in over time, not really disrupt it too much, and we also fund it through taxes, I think inflation is not really going to be a major concern.
All right, great. Anyone else want to throw in a question in the chat, or you can just state your question out loud if you'd like.
Where is the money coming from to pay all these people?
Yeah, I think, so we modeled, actually, Nate, do you want to talk about some of the tax policies we've modeled here?
Yeah, so for the child allowance simulation, it was a flat tax on taxable income. So at the federal level, like I had showed, it's about 1% per $100 a month that you're sending children. So if you want a $200 a month child allowance, you need about an added 2% flat tax on taxable income. We did the same modeling at the state level, and it depends on the state what the rate is, but it's usually around that percent per $100 a month. For the FPUC, the unemployment comparison, that was just a straight up comparison to the dollar amount from the same amount that we were already spending on unemployment. So all of our simulations are budget equivalent or budget neutral. So they're either tax funded or funded by removing other programs. It really depends on the simulation, but most of our simulations don't have an impact on the budget.
And for example, with Andrew Yang's plan that I talked about earlier, there were a number of funding approaches there. There was a value-added tax, which is essentially like a consumption tax. So it's kind of like the sales tax you pay at the store, but it applies to more goods and services. It's really common in all other developed countries. So it's a very broad-based tax. It raises a lot of revenue for a relatively low percent, which doesn't mean it's felt by a lot of people. But I think one thing we found consistently is even if your tax is either flat or even the VAT is slightly regressive, meaning that as a share of income, people would pay a little bit more if they're poor compared to if they're rich. But the UBI just offsets that really by probably an order of magnitude. So as long as you're using the money for progressive means, and UBI is a very progressive means in terms of percentages, it doesn't matter all that much how you fund it. There's a lot of options available. Does that answer your question?
Well, kind of. You're not talking a tax on income. You're talking a flat tax, as in on purchases and other things. More like a sales tax, not an income tax.
So Nate was talking about an income tax. The tax that we modeled for the child allowance was an income tax. And then there's also the VAT, which is a sales tax. So there's a number of ways we could do it. And we intend to model as many of them as possible, because it's going to need a lot of money, which is going to require, I think realistically, we are going to, I doubt you could do it entirely through a VAT in the US. You probably could, but it would be a major lift, given we also, compared to other countries, we have the lowest tax to GDP ratio of other developed countries. And it's largely because we don't have a VAT, but also even our income tax revenue is not as high as some other countries. So we'll probably need some income tax reform as well as something like a VAT.
Have they studied whether crime, specifically robbery type crime, robbery and theft, whether that goes down if people get this?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, Yeah, so Thomas More was right in the 1500s. There have been studies from Alaska. There's a program called the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend. So Alaska has a bunch of oil revenue that they put into essentially like a social wealth fund. So they put it into an account and they invest it all over the world. And the interest that they make on that fund, they then send as checks to every person who lives in Alaska. So every year you get an unconditional cash payment in Alaska. And they found that right after people get that check, the property crime falls consistently. So, yeah.
All right, we have one more here in the chat. This question, what could the federal government or Census Bureau or Bureau of Labor and statistics do to make running these simulations easier and more accurate?
This is an awesome question. Thank you, Nick. Yeah, I think there's so much they could do. So right now, for example, a very basic thing that they could do is the IRS has what's called a public use file, which is a sample of tax filers that they anonymize some data for, and they also sort of just clean it up so that it's non-identifiable. But they still charge about $10,000 for people to use that file. So if you want to get pretty accurate tax record data, you basically have to pay the government to do that research. And that is a bit of an issue for us. There are some folks who are building a synthetic version of that data. This gets a little bit wonky. But basically everything we do, I think it's important to note, is based on what's called microdata. So that basically means every person, I'll step back a bit. Every month when the government reports the unemployment rate, wage trends, all those kinds of things, that's actually based on a survey. Mostly the current population survey, which surveys about 0.1% of the population. So 1 in 1,000 people is literally saying, I worked this many hours last week. I earned this much last week. These are the people in my household, the ages. This is the kind of work I do. Just a whole bunch of things. And they actually release those per survey record data. They clean it up so it's not going to result in a disclosure so people can't identify it. But they basically release that data close to raw. And that is a huge help for us because we can say, we don't have to rely on merging different aggregates. We can actually just say, how would this person be affected by this policy? How would every single person in the country, or at least in the sample, be affected by the policy? So the more accurate micro data that we have, the more we can do. I'll give you another example. The Survey of Consumer Finances is a survey administered every 3 years. So they release the data for that, and it shows, for example, the wealth distribution. So if we want to say what's the effect on wealth inequality of doing a UBI, we would have to use data from 3 years ago. It's a smaller sample than the current population survey. So you just have a lot more noise around your estimates. And it means that we're not as up to date on what's happening, for example, in the economy today. So I think if they just released more of that micro data on a more regular basis, don't charge for anything, make everything as open as possible. The US is actually quite good here. The UK does not let anyone who's not affiliated with a UK university get the microdata. So lots of countries are much more private than we are. So I think the US is doing a good job, but we could do even better there.
All right, great. And before we wrap up, I know we may have some people here who sort of identify as effective altruists or who are interested in that topic, which is kind of something we've been focusing on in our last couple talks last week and the week before too, when we had Giving What We Can here. So if either of you would like to speak to how you connect this work to the idea of effective causes and effective altruism, have at it.
Nate, why don't you go first? I've got some ideas, but I'm sure both of us do. So,
yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is kind of the cash benchmarking or cash threshold that Give Directly has kind of set the precedent for. Is that in charity, when we give, we want to be as effective with our money as we possibly can, right? And Give Directly consistently ranks as one of those top charities. So there's no reason that we shouldn't have the same approach to public policy, that when we're going to spend money, we want to get the most bang for our buck, and we want to help people in the best way that we can. So I think that's the first direct correlation I make between the two. And the second is just that every person should be guaranteed some standard of living. And I think effective altruism seeks that in the long run. Like in a short term, it's, getting the most for your money. And I think that's what we're focused on at the UBI Center. Like when we're comparing policies, we want to get the most for our money. We want to help the people at the bottom. And then there's kind of like a bigger picture goal of that, the world may be wealthy enough to guarantee a certain standard of living and that every person has their basic necessities. So there's that kind of correlation too.
Yeah, I just add, I think basically everyone, all the researchers at the UBI Center consider themselves effective altruists as well. I've been really moved. I mean, Give Directly has basically put me on the path to do this kind of work. I think their research is just incredibly compelling. So I've also seen the effective altruism movement develop from the earning to give kind of model to doing work that is going to change the world, and finding that earning to give still makes sense for some people, and probably everyone should give effectively when they can. But for most people, they're now recommending that you kind of do work that can change, that can have multipliers because of systems. And I think this is one of those kinds of systems. There's AI systems, making sure that AI is safe and aligned with human values, climate change, pandemic preparedness. All those kind of things require deep policy work. And I think poverty is the same, where you can do a lot of good lifting people out of poverty by giving to Give Directly. I think you can also do a lot of good by changing policy such that Give Directly, that basically more governments are doing things like what Give Directly is doing. And it doesn't have to be only Give Directly. But imagine, Kenya has a number of programs that probably are not as effective as the cash transfers that Give Directly is doing. So if we can convince people not only that this is a good thing to do through nonprofits that are doing the delivery, but also that it can be done within the constraints of government. It can be done with tax levers. There are different ways of doing it, and different ways may be better or worse, and sort of advising governments on that. I think that is pretty aligned with EA as well.
Yeah, and one last thing I'd add is that I was just kind of thinking about is that there is some sacrifice required from some people, whether that's giving like on your own through charitable giving, like effective altruism, or increasing taxes to fund a UBI. So those are correlated in that way too.
And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we do take donations. So if you'd like to go to ubicenter.org/give, we can also happy to share kind of what our plans are and the way we would use that kind of gift. So.
All right. I just put that link there. So yeah, if you'd like to give, and then guys, this has been really cool. Do you have any other places you'd like to send people if they want to learn more other than just UBI Center with any of the work you're involved in right now?
I think that's some of the main stuff. I mean, there's definitely political advocacy groups that are working toward UBI, especially in this time, making sure that universal payments were part of this package. So I think like incomemovement.org and Humanity Forward. Humanity Forward is essentially the continuation of the Andrew Yang group. There are a number of other poverty nonprofits that are doing this kind of work. The Columbia School of Poverty and Social Policy. So yeah.
And just
lots of great folks doing great work.
and just follow on Twitter. We do have some more great stuff coming out in the near future. So follow on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. You'll see the research as it comes out. And if you have an idea that you're interested in us, simulating, we're happy to hear about those ideas as well.
We also have a monthly newsletter. So if you go to the ubicenter.org, we can update you that way.
Great. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Everybody, we're glad you came. This is a big treat to have you here, and you guys are doing really impactful work. So thanks, and glad we could do it. And hopefully we'll hear from you again in the not too distant future.
Yeah, we'd love to come back and share research. Thanks so much for having us, Ryan, and thanks for the great questions, everyone.
Yeah, really, really amazing stuff, amazing simulations. So I'll stick around for a second if anyone's like writing down links or wants to ask about any of that, but thanks for coming. We have one of these talks every week. And if you're interested, you can put your email in the chat. I'll email you more about that. And thanks again. Happy holidays. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
All right. Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Max.